One of the most common lawsuits against law enforcement involve entering a house without a warrant. Common situation looks like this. You get dispatched to a domestic. You don't know if it's physical or if it's just verbal. When you get there, you knock on the door and the suspect answers the door and refuses to let you come in the house and goes to shut the door on your face. You stick your foot in the door or you grab it with your hand and force your way in. You're now inside the house without a warrant. What exceptions to the warrant requirement apply here? Do you know how to articulate that when you write your report, when you testify? Is it illegal? I'm going to answer these questions in this episode of the Tactical In-Service Podcast right now. Welcome back, everybody. I'm attorney Eric Scramlin, and this is the Tactical In-Service Podcast, a podcast dedicated to law enforcement, where I break down training topics and case law to help you, the law enforcement community, stay up on the law. Before I get started today, if you haven't already done so, hit that subscribe button down there. Got a whole bunch of episodes coming out. I also want to announce, before I get started with this, because I'm talking about search and seizure today. If you're a New Mexico officer, you know how hard it is to get New Mexico specific training. I'm doing a training at the Las Cruces Police Department on September 19th. This is my flagship course. It is New Mexico Search and Seizure Mastermind, where I'm going to be covering New Mexico specific law as it relates to search and seizure in New Mexico. Everything, the warrant requirement and all of the recognized exceptions under New Mexico law using New Mexico specific case law. Got a limited amount of seats available. If you want more information, go to my website at tacticalattorney.com. Give me a call so I can get you registered for the course that's coming up. Seats are limited. All right, let's jump into this week's episode. I'm going to be talking about warrantless home entry. This is going to be kind of the 10,000-foot view. And in some further episodes, I'm going to take a deeper dive into each of the categories that I talk about today. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about the home, what the courts describe as, under the Fourth Amendment, the chief among equals. We know that the courts treat our homes as if it's our castle, and they're going to apply a ton of scrutiny when you, law enforcement, go in there and you don't have a warrant. One of the seminal cases from the United States Supreme Court that I'm going to discuss a little bit today is Kentucky versus King, where the United States Supreme Court said the Fourth Amendment ordinarily requires police to get a warrant before entering a home, unless you have permission. But an officer may make a warrantless entry when the exigency of the situation creates a compelling law enforcement need. What do they mean by that? Well, they mean emergency situations. There are going to be situations when you as law enforcement don't have time to get a warrant. There's a burning building and people are yelling, "Help me." You don't have time to get a warrant. You get dispatched to a shots fired call and you can see people inside the house yelling for help. You don't have time to get a warrant. These are emergency situations. Maybe evidence is being destroyed, or maybe you're chasing someone that just committed a felony. An armed robbery suspect is running into the house. We don't want to let them get away and escape or destroy evidence or become a risk to someone else, so we chase the fleeing felon into the house. I'm talking about exigent circumstances and how they apply as an exception to the warrant requirement. So as I mentioned, the Supreme Court obviously says it's a big deal when you enter a house and you don't have a warrant. When I was at the city attorney's office, this was a big area of lawsuits because there is confusion amongst law enforcement on exactly what are the exceptions, how do they apply, and how do I articulate them. I see a lot of confusion. So in this episode, I want to go over kind of the 10,000-foot view. What is exigent circumstances? What do you need to know about it? And then we'll take a deeper dive into some later episodes. So what am I talking about? The court says you got to have a warrant. That's what we need. That's your default. You should always never go into a house unless you have a warrant. And if you don't have a warrant, then you look to one of these exceptions. So what are the exceptions I'm talking about? Well, this is what the courts say. If you don't have a warrant, the only way you get into a house is with consent of the owner or exigent circumstances. All right. Most situations, you're not going to have consent. That's a different topic, a little bit easier to understand. But exigent circumstances, what are they? What are the categories? The three categories are this. They say that these are the three recognized categories for exigent circumstances. Number one is hot pursuit. We also call that the fleeing felon rule. Destruction of evidence, and the emergency scene exception. Let's start with hot pursuit. misunderstandings here, and we have recent case law from the United States Supreme Court. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, I'm going to have it scroll up there on the screen, the breakdown that I did in Lang versus California, a recent United States Supreme Court case that discussed the fleeing felon or hot pursuit when it comes to a misdemeanor suspect. So check that episode out. That'll give you a little bit of a deeper dive into what I'm going to go into today. So when we talk about hot pursuit, generally the rule is this: you must have probable cause as the officer to arrest someone. This crime must have happened, or the pursuit must have started in a public place and the person is fleeing into the home. If you have probable cause to arrest them, it's a felony, and they go from public place to private place, you can chase after them. The courts have sort of assumed that when it's a felony that the exigency exists because they may escape, they may be a risk to the society, and it might take resources to find them. When it comes to a felony, we can chase them into the house. If you have probable cause to arrest and it happens in a public place, or you see them in a public place and they flee. So that's the hot pursuit, aka fleeing felon rule. As I mentioned, how does this apply to misdemeanors? Because this is where officers get in trouble. I saw someone commit a minor traffic violation and they ran and I chased after them. Well, the courts have made it very clear in Lang versus California that they're not going to create a bright line rule. You can't just chase someone in the house just because they committed a misdemeanor in your presence, even if it's in a public place. You have to go back and talk about how one of those categories of exigent circumstances apply. Is there an emergency that you need to go in there? Is there destruction of evidence? You're going to have to be able to articulate those facts. That's in a nutshell, hot pursuit. All right, let's talk about destruction of evidence. In Kentucky versus King, the court did an excellent job of explaining kind of how destruction of evidence works. How is that a category of exigent circumstances? And there's a ton of cases out there, but this one from the United States Supreme Court breaks down some typical issues that we see. In Kentucky versus King, you had an undercover officer or an undercover CI doing a drug buy that was under surveillance, so it was a controlled buy. As soon as the buy happened, the uniformed police come in, they chase the suspect. They lose sight of him for a minute as he goes into the breezeway of an apartment complex, and then as the police get there, they think he's went into this apartment. They smell marijuana coming outside the door. They knock and announce police, and then they say they hear evidence or sounds of evidence being destroyed inside the apartment. So they kick in the door and go in without a warrant. Only problem was the guy they were chasing wasn't there. So the question was it a reasonable entry? And the court said it was. And they said a couple of things. First of all, the police, you as an officer, you can't create the exigency by violating the Fourth Amendment. What the officers did here was reasonable. They saw a drug deal happen in public. It's a felony. So the fleeing felon rule played into this at first because it was lawful for them to chase and it was lawful for them to be where they were at when they knocked on the door and announced. And then when they heard the people in there making sounds like they were destroying evidence and could smell marijuana, that gave them an emergency situation where if we don't go in right now, the evidence will be destroyed. So they go in, the court said that's reasonable. You have to be able to articulate that the destruction of evidence is imminent, meaning you don't have time to secure the house and get a warrant. An example of a case here in New Mexico several years ago is an officer walking down a public sidewalk and could see a greenhouse full to the brim of marijuana plants. The officer entered the property, the curtilage, so the Fourth Amendment protections of the house apply, with no warrant and seized the plants. It was suppressed. Why? Because the court said there was no evidence to that officer that why couldn't you just get a warrant? There was no evidence that someone was at the house that saw you there. There was no evidence that someone was about to destroy the evidence. There was no imminent destruction of the evidence. The officer just went on the property and got it. Now, if you see a guy running with a gas can, like throwing it all over it, trying to light it on fire, now you got to go. That's imminent destruction of evidence. So for destruction of evidence, you must be able to articulate that the destruction is imminent, just like they did in Kentucky versus King. All right, the final one, and the one that draws in the most lawsuits and ties into what I discussed in the intro of the episode here, is the emergency scene exception, the most misunderstood from law enforcement, and this is the one that we really need to understand, because this is what we rely on usually if you get dispatched to a domestic, a shots fired call, an emergency situation. And recently, the United States Supreme Court explained in Caniglia versus Strom that the community caretaker exception does not apply to houses. Instead, they said this does, the emergency scene exception. We can learn the most about the emergency scene exception if you read the case of City of Brigham, Utah versus Stewart. I'll leave a link in the description below. This is going to be a case that I'm going to take a deeper dive into on a future episode because this category alone deserves a full podcast episode. But essentially what the court said is there are situations when someone could be seriously injured, they could die, even property being destroyed, where we don't have time to get a warrant. It's an emergency that we have to go in right now. And you're going in to address the emergency. We're not going in to arrest people or investigate a crime. It's an objective emergency situation that allows us as officers to enter, to go in and address the emergency. So what we have to look at and what we have to be able to articulate if you're dispatched to the domestic is what facts do you have to tell you that there's an emergency inside, or is it just in your mind? If all you know is you're dispatched to a domestic and someone tries to slam the door in your face and you enter the house, it's probably going to be illegal. It's probably going to get suppressed and you're probably going to get sued. So you have to be able to articulate why. What is the emergency? And it can't just be a domestic call alone. You have to say, well, I got a 911 call. The dispatcher said there was multiple hangups and could hear someone screaming in the background. Or as you're knocking on the door, you can see something that tells you there's an emergency going on. Stuff's broken. There's blood. You can see someone laying on the ground. You have to be able to articulate that there's an emergency at hand right now and you don't have time to get a warrant. And that's the only way that it'll be justified when you go into the house under the emergency scene exception. One other thing I want to note when it comes to that is as soon as the emergency is done, then your reason for being there is also done. You have to get out of the property. So you have to be sure if you see something in plain view during the emergency, you can then use that to secure a search warrant. So deal with the emergency. If you find evidence in plain view, you can seize it, but then you want to get a search warrant to continue to be there because once the emergency's over, your reason for being there is over. Well, that's all I have for you guys. In conclusion, I want to make sure that you guys definitely hit that subscribe button because, like I said, I'm going to take a deeper dive into some of these cases and some of these categories because this is such a big area that will draw you into a lawsuit as a police officer. You have to know this law just like lawyers do. So that's all I have for you on this one, the overview. To recap it, if we're entering a house without a warrant, you have to have consent or exigent circumstances. I just listed in this episode the 3 categories of exigent circumstances that the courts have recognized. So you need to fit in one of those or else your entry into the house is illegal. So again, destruction of evidence, hot pursuit, or the emergency scene exception. Those are the 3 categories you need to know. And in future episodes, I'm going to take a deeper dive. If you're an officer out there somewhere across the country and you want me to come to your department and cover this, I have a 4th Amendment Mastermind course where I'll go into a ton of detail on this and other stuff. You can find more information at my website, tacticalattorney.com. If you have any questions about this or anything else, or you need to reach out, you can contact me through my website at tacticalattorney.com or leave them in the comments here. That's it, guys. Quick episode. Hope to hear from you as far as any questions you have. If not, I'll see you on the next episode. So remember, till next time, every battle is won before it's fought. Stay safe. See you in the next episode.